You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Much of the dysfunction in contemporary American politics is a consequence of the failure by our elites to understand the crucial relationship between immigration and nationalism. So say immigration lawyer Nathan Brown and conservative talk radio producer Robert Haglund, both of whom join me in this episode for a conversation about immigration and nationalism. That's right, I have not just one but two guests in this episode, Nathan and Robert, to talk about their new book, Rescuing the American Project: How Nationalism and Immigration Will Revive the Republic. Now, it's not escaped my attention nor theirs that immigration and nationalism are not typically two words you would wed together, but I think they make an interesting and compelling argument as to how these two actually fit and may provide for us a more sensible, durable immigration policy that would be far more agreeable to most Americans. Now, we end the conversation a bit early before we have a chance to nail down any concrete policy solutions that they have for our immigration woes, but those are in the book. So if you're listening to this conversation and feeling like you need a bit more, you should check out Rescuing the American Project. But with that, I give you my conversation with Nathan Brown and Robert Haglund.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
It has been many years since I've had more than one guest on one of these episodes, so it's exciting to welcome not one but two voices. I have with me Robert Haglund. Robert, good of you to be joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm talking to each of you individually so the audience will know which voice to separate with which individual. And of course, Nathan Brown. Nathan, good to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Nathan and Robert have both written a book, came out earlier this year. The audacious title, Rescuing the American Project, with the subtitle, How Nationalism and Immigration Will Revive the Republic. Two words, nationalism, immigration, you don't typically see wedded together all that often, but I think it'll be a fruitful conversation where we'll untangle why those things do in fact fit. But I want to start with immigration in that I don't think it's a surprise to anyone to suggest that immigration is a hot topic, a very controversial topic, and has been, to the best of my knowledge, for at least as long as my political memory goes back. So I want to start first with, from a historical perspective, has immigration ever not been a contentious issue here in the United States?
Yeah, I would definitely say no. It's always been controversial from the get-go, even through the War for Independence and most of our history after, maybe in the early 1800s, 1810s, 20s, maybe it wasn't too big of an issue, but it's definitely been a hot topic pretty much at every other period.
And that's sort of what I would expect. I mean, I suppose it's, to me, I think of immigration almost like our political civil discourse. It's bad. A lot of people agree it's bad. It's possibly worse than it's usually been, but there have been eras in the United States history where we literally Civil War, being won, and shortly after the War of Independence, where we're killing each other over civil discourse. So I think it's possibly helpful to anchor ourselves in that sort of realization. We're dealing with a topic we've never truly resolved in any meaningful fashion as a country for any point in time, saying, okay, this is what immigration is to be, and we've just recently kind of gotten off kilter. That being said, it's a topic that's difficult to boil down, but I'm going to try to do this unfairly between. Let's take a moment to look at the left and the right. What is it? And I'll introduce this from the prospect of what both sides get, let's say, wrong with the overall immigration debate or window. And we could start perhaps with the left. What would both of you gentlemen say, broadly speaking? Obviously, the left, their voices on the left, they probably have some very good views on immigration. But broadly speaking, where are they off kilter?
So I would say that the left, and I'm pretty harsh on the left, probably harsher than I am on the right. I do have a bias. And so I would say that, like a lot of things on the left, it's based more in wishes and, what should be than what actually can be. And I think what they take for granted is that any policy that they have is going to have political realities, political consequences. And so let's say that you were an immigration maximalist, like I think many on the left are. What that leads many on the left to do is say, okay, well, then therefore, a maximalist immigration policy right this minute is what's going to give us maximal immigration. And I don't think that's the case, because I think it discounts that immigration is going to have a reaction. And so that the more chaotic it is, the more people we bring in who maybe are, if you want to bring in cohorts that are more difficult to assimilate, then you're going to be able to bring in less of those people before you reach a point of backlash. If you want to actually maximize it, then you are probably going to have to bring in people who are more easily assimilated, who want to assimilate. And I don't know, in my view of that, that's just something that the left doesn't think about. They think about immigration right this minute, and not how will that affect what immigration looks like a year from now, 5 years from now.
Yeah, and I would say similar to a problem Republicans face, the Democrats face a major problem of their loudest, least reasonable activists being able to just blow up any efforts at compromise, throughout. I mean, it's been 20, 30 years now where not even just centrists, but I feel like the mainstream of each party would prefer to have some kind of reasonable solution. And it's the craziest 25% of each party that blows everything up. So I think that's part of it. But as getting back to your question, asking where does the left go wrong, I think one of the main things where they go wrong on the immigration question is being overly timid about the topic of nationalism and patriotism, and feeling like promoting our values and symbols and traditions will offend and alienate immigrants. And we tell the story in our book of a professor who he's maybe in his 40s, 50s now. He's from India. And he talks about how, as a kid, Fourth of July parades and Halloween and these very typically and uniquely American rituals were something very concrete and something very easy to participate in. It's actually pretty easy to show up at a barbecue and wave a flag and eat a hot dog and go trick-or-treating. And he talks about, as an adult, showing up in a grocery store and seeing an acquaintance bump into him and the acquaintance asks him, "Hey, what are you guys doing for Christmas?" And the person kind of catches themselves and feels embarrassed and corrects himself and says, "Oh, actually, I guess you don't do that. Sorry to put that on you." And the Indian American man says, the correction, the embarrassment is what was alienating. And if anything, these typical events were an easy access point for immigrants.
There is so much that could be said and has been said, obviously, about the left's broader, let's call it, multiculturalism views, good, bad, or indifferent. But I'm curious here, because when I ask the question, what does the left get wrong about immigration? It occurs to me it probably depends on the calendar, right? Which version of the left are we talking about, and at what point? 10, 20 years ago, I know it was sort of in vogue to kind of note that, look, if immigration trends continue the way they are, specifically with Hispanic Americans coming here from the United States, and they vote the way they historically always have, the Republican Party is over as a national party. There's just no, I think George W. Bush got the largest percentage of Hispanic votes at one point in time. And they even noticed that under Romney and McCain, had they gotten that exact same percentage, they would have lost the election, which they did. But they didn't even do as well as Hispanic Americans. And then in recent years, the Republican Party, and especially Donald Trump, blows this theory out of the water in a lot of ways, and that they have made some inroads within Hispanic Americans. And so I'm curious, because that is an argument or something we could talk about at great length. But if you pull it back even further, 30, 40, 50 years ago, my impression was the left did not have this sort of idea that let's welcome in all the masses. But they were far more restrictionist in their approach, because, as has been widely observed, the left had a larger role with, say, like working class Americans, and it was anti-working class to invite in immigrants and dilute the workforce. Anyhow, I'm not trying to bait the witness too much, but I'm just curious. Like, is it fair to say that what we refer to as the left's view of immigration has, in some ways, radically departed from what it historically had been?
Yeah, I think NAFTA is probably a pretty big delineating line there. And, Bill Clinton reshaped the Democratic Party and the left, I think, in some very serious ways that were underappreciated at the time. I think you had people who stayed true to that for a long time, like a Bernie Sanders. But I think that wing of the party is incredibly small right now, kind of that pro labor immigration restrictionist wing of the Democratic Party is
Which, and
almost too.
Sanders himself has almost left that perspective, from what I understand.
Yeah, and he has, I would say it seemed, 5 years ago that he was completely off that perspective. I'm not so sure that he is anymore. I think I think that he may have learned a little bit from what happened with Trump and learned that this is not an issue that is a foregone conclusion. And I think he was bullied maybe a little bit out of those beliefs. And it seems to me, at least in more recent interviews with him, that he is more timid about immigration. Back to the old Bernie. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you listen to old speeches from Obama in 2008, many people have made this observation. He sounds like Trump or someone from the right wing of the Republican Party. So there's definitely been a huge shift. There's a desire to be the purest person in the room, and on one side you have, you know, people competing to be the greatest humanitarian, the greatest angel, and then on the other side, people competing to be the biggest tough guy and flex the most.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to kind of also politicians, are always, sticking up their finger and trying to see which way the wind is blowing. And I think they're probably all wrong to some sort of a degree, but I think one of the most wrong things that both sides kind of believe is the extent to which it's inevitable when you have immigration, the way that those immigrants will behave. And I think you can see that in a contrast between the California Republican Party and the Texas Republican Party, where California Republicans were quite hostile, became quite hostile to immigration, and they had that famous ad of they keep coming, and instead of just expecting immigrants to assimilate and partake in their culture the way that they did in Texas, you have immigrants in California vote, not nearly in the same numbers for Republicans as they do in Texas. And part of that too is, I think, back to the nationalism thing. Texas, some people, when I lived there, they would say it was the greatest country in the nation. And they have their own sense of nationalism. And I think that Texas, probably for that reason, is able to assimilate immigrants a little bit better than California is, because of that strong sense of identity. And that in turn causes immigrants to not necessarily look at the two parties as one party that's friendly to them and one party that's unfriendly to them. They're adopting the culture, and so they see themselves as part of the culture and less of an other than they might in California.
So, and I definitely want to get to the role that nationalism, or a variety of other substitute words we might throw in there, um, does in aiding our assimilation. But before we do that, for equal opportunity, let's turn to the right for just a moment. Again, broadly speaking, what are they getting wrong? What are they missing about the broader immigration debate?
I think the right's more difficult because it's less homogenous than the left right now, and so I think you have two very big factions that are vying, and the nativist right, what what they get wrong in a lot of senses is the same thing that the left gets wrong, in that they're just completely unrealistic about what uh, America would look like with no immigration or very minimal immigration, and the what that would do to their views based on what it does to the economy. And so you have another that would be the Steve Bannons, that wing of the party, and you have on the other side kind of a Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk now side of the party that is very pro-immigration. And I think what's interesting is both of those factions do exist in this administration. They do exist in Congress. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion which way the party goes in that sense. But when you have the nativist right, yeah, I think they don't take economics seriously enough or realistically enough, and they imagine the same way that the left imagines utopias. I think they imagine a utopia where the United States domestically builds every component of every product, and that somehow makes us wealthier when we need to be specializing, and we need to be bringing in talent that we don't have. Even things that the right would, the pro labor right now, kind of that Steve Bannon, you could imagine them looking at a job like an airline mechanic and seeing that as a very noble profession and something that we should want more of, want people to grow up in that, make their career in that. We are, I think, 10 years older than the global average for airline mechanics. And so you just have a lot of these people who are quickly retiring out with those skills without having taught enough of the younger generation. Uh, and we will lose that unless we have these intermediary steps of bringing people in who can do those jobs and who can teach people, even if that's your dream, is for Americans who are born here, who have been here since the Mayflower, to do all of these jobs. It's just not realistic that that can, happen with the flip of a border wall switch.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I think where the right goes wrong on this issue, I think the core of it has to do with the question of culture. There's a lot of concern about preserving our culture, and I absolutely think that's valid and important. There's so much about our history that we have to preserve, but I think on the right there's not a deep understanding of what our culture really is at its core, and just in general what produces culture. And in my view, and we try to express this in the book, culture is downstream from the task. Culture is downstream from a sacred order. And from the very beginning, part of our understanding of our errand in the wilderness, our national vocation, had at the center immigration, and that these immigrants coming to join us, not everyone, not MS-13 members, obviously, and we can use some common sense to distinguish the good from the bad. But these immigrants are part of our story, part of our vocation, and they have an integral part in making America what it needs to be and where it needs to go. And I think trying to preserve a culture while disconnecting it from the grand task is just LARPing. It's adornment. And LARPing is fine as long as it's oriented to the goal, to the ultimate task. And it's ironic on the right, there's so much forgetting of what our foundations were about and what they were pointing toward.
Yeah, I think if I can just jump on something Nathan kind of said, but give it a little more attention, is that we can have common sense. And I think that is another area where the right makes a very, very big mistake, is that much of that nativist right thinks that this is a binary situation where we can't have common sense. We either have to have no immigration or a leftist version of immigration policy. And obviously, there are many, many ways that we could run an immigration system, and it doesn't have to be a chaotic import, every MS-13 member you can find, and demand that they can never be deported. That doesn't have. It's not a question between being pro that or being anti-immigration, and that, I would say, is maybe, if I can change my answer, I think that's the biggest mistake the right makes.
So I don't want to avoid this too much longer, because of course the crux, I think, of your argument, as I understand it, is that it's this healthy dose of nationalism. Again, probably a phrase we need to flesh out somewhat, that allows for the sort of assimilation that would make immigration policy make sense, make it work, make it not only more feasible, but something that's more, say, digestible to the average American. If I don't have that right, please let me know. But if I do, I think it's needful that we spend a little bit of time trying to work through this. I'm sure this is not news to you guys. The term nationalism is problematic. So how are we defining nationalism, and how are we distinguishing nationalism from what is understandably historically argued to be a very terrible idea?
Good question. The central question here. Uh, People say, let's just talk about patriotism, love of country. And Robbie and I are both for patriotism. We love our country, but nationalism, obviously related. It's a different thing. Nationalism is about fostering, cultivating a shared identity and a sense of unity, getting behind shared projects, and a sense of shared history. And in many forms of nationalism, it's about shared ancestry, literally. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about, this kind of racial idea of nationalism. Lincoln talked about immigrants who fully and sincerely assimilated having the same right to membership in the community as if they were sons and daughters of the founders. And I think in that sense, that's an important part of nationalism, is the assimilation. And when that does happen, it's as if immigrants become part of the community, in the sense of almost being like adopted sons and daughters into the program. And we got to look at assimilation, maybe not quite as like a religious conversion, but something like adoption into a broad, extended family, where even if there isn't literal ancestry in the founders of the founding generation, there is a deep connection to the project and to the people who brought this country about.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that people know this deep down, that they know that it's not a racial thing. And a really easy way to, check yourself if you think it's a racial thing or not. And people on the right, I don't think any of them are saying that the Irish or the Italians are not ancestrally American. I mean, maybe you can find some in very small pockets, but the broader nativist movement is not. They might even be somewhat racist, but I think what even they would admit is that you have all these races that come into America, and as they assimilate and become more American, all of the sudden they become, white. So the Irish and the Italians weren't considered white, and then they assimilated, and now they're white. And I think one of the underreported, because it's such a slow moving story, but one of the unreported stories of the past 30 years is the way that Hispanics and especially Mexicans are just becoming white in America, in a way that somebody, in the 60s wouldn't have expected, where there would be a very strong delineation. And, so many of the people of Hispanic ancestry who I know personally in LA, who maybe their parents came over here, even it could be that close, or their grandparents, and they consider themselves white, and the people around them consider themselves white. And so I think you have in America something where, we we, for the past decade and a half, have really, really fixated on a bunch of toxic, racist stuff. But when it comes down to it, I think Americans have a deep sense for the way that race really isn't definite. And I think there's a conflation that happens a lot with American and white among that segment. But I don't think it's real in any way. I think if you interrogate it, like with the Italians, like with the Irish, and it will be the same way 30 years from now with Hispanics, it all falls apart.
Yeah, that's a big subject, obviously, right? Because especially for those who spent, and maybe I'm in this camp, too much time online, you could easily be forgiven for saying, wait, I think at least half of America is fixated on race in that capacity. And it's hard to know to what degree. I mean, those voices are definitely out there. I don't want to deny that, and it's a powerful force within the left and the right, with even if they're minorities within those areas. But I am I want to hang out a little bit on the nationalist term because I think it would not do us much justice just to skate through it. Why does it not work for us to simply substitute nationalism with patriotism? And I say this because I'm there's a vigorous debate on the right, as you gentlemen I'm sure are well aware of. To what degree is the United States a nation in the sense of blood and soil? Let's just take racism out of it, just sort of ancestral, we. I use this example very often. I live in the city of Tulsa. I also live in Tulsa County, Oklahoma. When I tell someone I'm from Tulsa, it's just understood I'm talking about the city. Nobody thinks what I mean is I'm swearing some allegiance to a rectangular box some politicians drew up many years ago. It doesn't have the same kind of depth to it and history and things that we associate with this thing as ours. And so I think that there's a version of that is not only healthy and good, but is almost what's the word I'm looking for? It's inescapable. I think we have a sense of sort of the Roger Scruton sense of conservatism. We identify things that are ours, things that are given to us, things we inherit, and we naturally have an affinity to those things. And from that, and this is even an Edmund Burke idea, that's where you can begin to build family and society in nation states. The reverse of that, obviously, is that, well, wait a minute, but the United States is also an idea. It's something that allows us to graft in more than just, as you were saying earlier, the Irish and the Italians, but also the Ethiopians and the Bangladeshians and people who have even less of a ancestral or genetic, say, connection to your average American. It's something that if they swear allegiance to certain ideas, that is, in effect, what makes them American. But I think these things can also be in tension, right? Because is it just a nation that is just an idea, or is it a nation in the same sense that all other nations are nations? It's got borders and it has history. I know it's kind of a long-winded question, but I guess I'm wondering, like, does patriotism, in your view, not capture that adequately, or why nationalism?
I don't think patriotism captures the horizontal component to nationalism, and let me explain that. What I mean by that, and this is not something I've come up with. Other academics have come up with this. That patriotism they describe as a vertical connection between the individual and the country, broadly speaking, the government. And nationalism is more of a horizontal phenomenon between laterally to your fellow citizens and developing a shared identity, a common cultural grammar and ability to operate within the same rules of the road to some extent. And there are different ways of going about that, creating a shared culture. There are heavy handed, bad, wrong ways of going about that. And in our book, we lay out a more libertarian approach. We can develop a shared culture without it being the government wagging their finger in our face, saying, this is, what you're going to celebrate. This is who your hero is going to be. But in civil society, as much as we can, we are arguing we ought to work to develop this shared culture. And Going back to a question you asked earlier, what's the left missing out on? What's the right missing out on getting wrong right now? And one very concrete thing I would say we're missing is that in the early 20th century, there were countless small and medium sized organizations that were devoted to assimilating people, helping immigrants assimilate to the culture. And we look at that as, oh, that's offensive, that's unkind, that's intolerant. No, it's not. It's none of the above. It's helpful. It's facilitating the immigrant and helping them understand what's going on here, how they can operate here. And to the extent we try to hide that, we're just submerging a culture that's there. And by helping them assimilate, we're making that legible and visible to them. I don't want to ramble too much or filibuster here, but this
Yeah.
idea of America as an idea, that's great. The ideas are very crucial, but I'll just say this. In 2020, I was watching a panel of historians talking about the issue of tearing down statues. I think it was Annette Gordon Reed and a couple other historians saying, these historical figures, Washington, Jefferson, they had their hands dirty. How about let's get rid of statues to people, and let's have a statue of equality and a statue to due process and statues to abstractions. I think that's weird. I think that's detaching from humanity. And if your commitment to these abstractions, these nice, clean, crisp, intangible things, you're so attached to them that it makes you disdain the actual flesh and blood people in front of you and your history. We've gone off the rails, and that's part of why I see civic nationalism as well intended, but it's missing something. It's missing a human component. At the end of the day, these abstractions only have value to the extent they orient us to other people. And if we're above, we can't bear the foul stench of Washington and Jefferson. We've strayed here.
Yeah. I mean, what would you say patriotism is, Josh?
I mentally prepare myself if I'm on someone's show to just fire off with answers, and then if I'm asked on my own, I have a hard time. No, it's a very fair question, and I think sometimes when people make a distinction between, say, patriotism and nationalism, what they're really doing is saying, I mean love for country that's not racist. And I don't necessarily mean that. I'm open to various definitions of patriotism. I guess I had brought it up earlier because when Nathan had mentioned nationalism, not just patriotism, I was curious what the distinction was there. Let me put it this way, right quick. I like Robert Brennan Doherty's definition of nationalism, that it is patriotism in an agitated state. In other words, you tend to have more nationalist feelings when your country's been invaded. And so he would say, by that light, nationalism is neither good nor bad. Full stop. Is just a matter of the context of what are we talking about. Is it an appropriate agitation? And so I think for me, patriotism tends to be less a reactionary defensive mode and more just love of country, whereas nationalism is at times good and necessary, a sort of, I need to defend this against some perceived, very possibly real threat.
I mean, yeah. So I think that's interesting because I think if I think it's going to be the rare person who would use the term nationalism instead of patriotism if you were talking about what increased in America after 9/11. I think most people would say it was a sense of patriotism that we all felt. But I think what that patriotism was is exactly what you're talking about, where it was that defensive mode. And so I don't see that distinction as being something that is how both of those words end up being used, or their academic definitions of them. And I think part of the problem we have here is that patriotism is kind of a little bit like nailing Jello to a wall. I mean, some people would just say it means my country right or wrong, but I don't. I think, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest differences are, one, I think nationalism has more of a sense of being involved in a national project, in building, whereas, and maybe this is where there is some sense of the definition you're talking about, in that patriotism seems to me, it's not that it's not racist, it's that it's a little more passive. It's not being actively engaged with the nation and what the nation's project is and the building of that nation. And the other big difference that I think there is, now we've come to see the word meme as just something that means a joke. But what Richard Dawkins was talking about with mimetic devices are these things that take very large concepts and distill them into small things that we can all absorb in a way that doesn't take the same sort of energy or understanding. And so you think of Aesop's fables. There's many examples of these mimetic devices, and I think, as religion and intermediary civic institutions like Elks Lodges, bowling clubs, all the Robert Putnam bowling alone stuff, as that has waned, I think a more expansive nationalism to cling on to an American project becomes even more necessary, and patriotism just doesn't suffice. Whereas nationalism is much more civically engaged than patriotism, or just flag waving or anything like that is.
And I do know that nationalism and patriotism have, those words themselves have been defined and used by various groups for very different purposes at times. So that's why I kind of think it can be helpful to define those terms. I appreciate that, and I may want to return to that in just a moment, but I want to move to, I'm sure this is not something you guys haven't encountered 1,000 times. If we are hoping to cultivate this sort of nationalism to aid an assimilation for the immigrant, how realistic or possible is that if we're living in a moment where seemingly we can't agree as a nation on what exactly we're trying to assimilate people into? Is this something that's somewhat elastic? In other words, is the argument, look, here is the version we want to bring up America in, or is it more we have to find some broad way to define this so that both the progressive left and the conservative right can identify this as something that they're at least, let's say, can compromise with, right? Maybe they're not super comfortable. Obviously, if we could all agree we want to make this Bernie Sanders America, or we want to turn it into a Norman Rockwell painting, I don't think we have a hard time, okay, I know how to do that. But what happens if this part of the country wants to go that way and this part wants to go this way? What's the elasticity there? How do we work past that tension?
Yeah, there's a degree of elasticity for sure, but it's not infinitely elastic. And I think, I think we are circling back still through these definitions of patriotism, where I think patriotism is infinitely elastic. I don't think nationalism is, and there may be people who are not on board with the national project, and that's fine. They can make their arguments, but I don't think that's what America is. And I don't think we need to apologize for that. Just like there might be people in, you know, in a communist country, there might be people in Cuba who say, you know what, I'm not on board with this national project. And maybe their solution is that they need to go elsewhere, because that's what the project is right now. And I don't I don't have a problem saying to people who want to throw out all of our unifying founding myths and figures, and our national ethos. I don't have a problem saying, yeah, I'm sorry, you have a right to say whatever you want, but that's not America. That's not American. And you can be anti-American, and you can go live in San Francisco and say, I think of myself more as living in a European city here in San Francisco. And you can have all of those views, but there is something that it means to be American, and there is a shared tradition and a shared mythology too, that isn't always necessarily a 100% accurate accounting of everything that's ever happened in America, but it is an appeal to the better angels of our nature and the ideas that we were founded on, and really, that phrase, a more perfect union, of being engaged in that project of creating a more perfect union, not creating a different union, not swapping out the original ideals, but perfecting those and bringing those to their logical conclusion.
Yeah, Josh, I think your question is crucial. I think it's spot on. You take somebody, take a stereotypical person from Boston and maybe a stereotypical person from Louisiana, and we're out in California, stereotypical person from California. They can all be fully American, but very different in a lot of ways. And Robbie's articulated this before. That's good, and there should be room for different interpretations of what it is to be an American. But there is a substrate. There is substantial overlap that we know what we're talking about here. We Americans, we know what is American and what's not, and there's a bit of a you know it when you see it kind of thing. Nietzsche said it's impossible to define anything with the history, and this is kind of a cliche, but if you're feeling not clear on what it means to be an American, go to another country, and you're going to be able to see really quick. And the guy from Louisiana or Boston or LA, when they run into each other, they're going to feel it. It's going to be almost tangible for them to be like, okay, yeah, you're my people. I get it.
So part of my concern, because I think you're right, the guy from Boston, Louisiana, LA, wherever, will have this sort of kinship, say, of recognition of a kindred spirit. I think part of my concern is in the moment we're in. Let's acknowledge, because I think it's fair to say that there are voices on the left and the right who would deny, or Robert, kind of as you were saying, who would have a viewpoint that would be out of kilter with a broader sense of this nationalist project we're talking about. Sometimes on the left, it's a bit more clear when they talk about, look, well, America was a mistake from the beginning. It was built on a racist past. We're not trying to conform it to this nationalism. We're trying to, I don't know how close Sanders comes to this, but he's consistently talking about how Europe is kind of ahead of us in the way it's done things, and kind of a notion that, hey, we need to adopt these principles. And there are these voices on the right too, certain elements of Christian nationalism, that's a charged term. I have problems with, again, some of them that I don't square that quite as easily with, say, a Madisonian founding in the United States. But my broader concern is not what I think would rightly be defined as fringe groups, not because I think their opinions are completely invalid, but just they're within the rank. I don't think most Americans fall in either of those two camps I'm describing. However, I do see a lot of animosity towards all these Americans that probably largely agree that they could be forgiven for thinking, oh, wait a minute, it seems to me in the culture war, the type of culture that one side wants to get a hold of is to essentially write me out of the American project. And maybe they're not going to say I'm not an American, but somehow I'm not as valid. Somehow I'm not as, my voice doesn't count, in effect. The barista at the transsexual barista at a Starbucks in Boston probably does not feel like they have a home if the people running Branson America suddenly took over the entire United States. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, to a degree, how do we communicate effectively to each other? It's okay that you're different in Boston than Los Angeles or Louisiana, that we celebrate diversity, even if I disagree with you, say. How do we distinguish between this is something that's anti-nationalist versus this is just a different expression of nationalism that I might not agree with, but I still welcome as my fellow American?
I mean, first of all, I would say that obviously the transsexual barista has a place here because they're making coffee and not tea.
Hey, now I'm a big tea drinker.
Well, then. But no. So I think we've been dancing around this, and maybe we need to concretize it a little bit. And I would say that so what does it mean? What's that substrate that Nathan mentioned that we can be building diverse and different things atop of? What is that nationalism? And I think it's, it is a love for, and this is going to be hard for some people, maybe the hardest one, but I think it is a love for our founding ideals, for our founding story, and for our creed. And it is a respect for individual rights, for individual sovereignty. Um, it's a reverence for our history, for our symbols, for George Washington, for, Thomas Jefferson, and so many of these complicated figures. And do you know what? If you are somebody where that's too complicated for you, then take, a Frederick Douglass, um, somebody who I would say was very much an American nationalist, even after being a slave, because he recognized the importance and the uniqueness of our founding ideals, even if they weren't perfectly applied. I think what we had with the founding generation was we had this discovery of, theoretical Americanism, and ever since then, it's been trying to perfect an applied Americanism. And so, that does mean openness to people of any race or sub-ethnicity or prior nationality who want, and this is the important part, who want to come here and be American and absorb what America is, helping us maintain our culture and our values, and even, our Christian values, even if you're not a Christian. Vivek Ramaswamy is excellent at explaining how he can still practice Hinduism and appreciate the Christian ideals that this country was built upon. And that those Christian ideals are extremely important to him as somebody who practices Hinduism. I think it is, having those small government beliefs, as much as we've gotten away from that, you know, at least at least rhetorically supporting that until we can figure out how to bring it back in a way that lands closer to home. It's our national sovereignty. It's actually having borders, and it's respecting that we are a different country than Canada. We are a different country than Mexico. And it is not just a free flow, because we are building something here. It's, needing to have a military that can defend us. It's also, I think, hugely culturally American. I think this is one of, to me, when Nathan and I first started talking about this book, this is one of the things that I was most passionate about, was this thought to me that when we stop having robust immigration, we stop selecting for risk takers. We have people who have just kind of been here. They're not the creators. They're not, there's a reason that so many companies in America are created by immigrants. There's a reason that it's like half the Fortune 10 companies are created by immigrants. And that is because we have selected for a rugged frontier ethos. And what we need to do to keep that going, to keep that infusion of fresh risk takers and fresh frontier mentality, is to keep having immigration. But that's why immigration is such an important part of our culture. It's not to water down our culture. It's to maintain that entrepreneurial spirit and that frontier spirit. You don't maintain the frontier spirit by taking the safe path through college while living at your parents' house until you're 40. That, as a 16th generation American, that's not going to maintain the things that made America great. And so what I think is really interesting is a lot of the people who will say make America great again, I agree with them. I think that we have had some slippage, and part of making America great again is restoring that frontier spirit and wrestling it back from people who want to say, hey, I need a path from kindergarten through my master's degree or PhD that guarantees me a spot as an elite in this country, and where I don't have to take risks, and where somebody's always telling me what to do and I don't have to figure anything out. It's just, this is my pre-prescribed path. And that's where I go. That's not American. What is American is figuring out what this country needs more of, and continuing to make it better than other countries, and being an American chauvinist and a little bit of a jingoist, and saying, yeah, America is better and this is why, and we're going to make sure that it stays on top by continuing to have these types of people with this type of ethos.
That's perfectly well said. I don't want to mess with that. That's
yes,
good.
I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak, but it looked like you wanted to defer there. One of Joel Goldberg's go-to lines when he's talking about, when he says, when I'm asked, what is your preferred immigration policy, is he always kind of jokingly says, to have one. In other words, it's the first and foremost is not what is the rate of immigration, where are they coming from, and all this. It's the sense that our immigration is effectively out of control. Now, maybe one could say under the Trump administration that is less true than it was under Biden. But I think in a truer sense, I would say over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we have had seemingly very little control over immigration policy, in the sense that we don't have a secured border, and we don't seem to have the willpower or ability to stop those who come here legally through a path of seeking, and then just overstay their visas. And so I'm curious here, how much of this entire argument we've been having about nationalism and assimilation, how much of this is just actually blown out of the water, because in effect, we the American people do not trust, for very good reason, our government to actually affect whatever immigration policy we want. And Goldberg had even made the statement to the effect of, look, I'm not saying I'm for this, but I would even be open to if we had an effective border and if we had effective policy, I'd even be open to maybe we just end immigration for a period of time. Maybe we double it. Maybe we put it from this part, but whatever the plan is, it just seems like it doesn't, we can come up with all these great plans, but they're never going to get put into effect because there's no one actually controlling this process. Is that a fair critique Americans have? And if so, how do we rekindle trust so that we can affect an immigration policy so that when we can have these debates about assimilation and nationalism?
Yeah, I think obviously efforts to reform immigration have failed over and over and over for the past 30, 40 years. And I think this gets all psychologized and what's wrong with people. We're too polarized. But to some extent, I think we have a very concrete problem. And the core of it is that the border has been in chaos the entire time. And we're not going to arrive at a stable agreement if that's in chaos. And I think the main reason for that is we do not effectively punish illegal entry. It's treated legally, it's a misdemeanor. First-time entry is a misdemeanor with a maximum of 180 days imprisonment. In practice, people get a week to 2 weeks if they're actually prosecuted, and it's about only 1% of the time that they're actually prosecuted. So there's not a really strong disincentive. A person's looking at 40 years of dramatically higher wages, a better life. That's the upside. The downside is a slap on the wrist. So I think a core part of it is, we lay this out in our book, we're very pro-immigrant, but we want a stable border, and that requires punishing the behavior that we're trying to deter. Like in California and throughout the country, when there was all this shoplifting, people scratching their heads, why is this happening? Well, guess what? It's pretty simple, because you're not punishing the behavior you're trying to deter. And so we could afford politically to be generous with dreamers and high-skilled immigrants if we had a credible southern border policy, which requires getting tough and punishing illegal entry.
As a reminder to the listener, the name of the book Rescuing the American Project, How Nationalism and Immigration Will Revive the Republic. Nathan, Robert, thank you both for taking time to come on to explain that. I think we just barely dipped our toes in this entire issue, but I appreciate you enlightening us to the degree we were able to in this time. Thank you both for coming on the Saving Elephant Show.
Thank you very much.
Been a pleasure, Josh.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.